Hello, this is Dr. Matthew Minard. Before we begin today's Maritain Musings, I just want to make a quick remark regarding the format. Normally, we do our recording using an online platform, which enables us to capture the audio slightly better because it locally takes the audio in and then uploads it to the service. However, due to certain technical issues with our guest today, Dr. Michael Torre, we had to use Zoom. He was abroad on sabbatical, and we had some issues with the platform at the last minute. So I just wanted to apologize for any issues of audio along the way. But we thought that it was useful for us to get this interview in, and from a scheduling perspective, it was quite necessary for both of us. So we went ahead and used Zoom. But I just wanted to at least make a note about the change of platform for this this episode of our podcast. So thank you very much, as always, for joining us, and I hope that you enjoy the conversation that we had today. Welcome to Maritain Musings, a project of the American Maritain Association. I'm Matthew Minard, and today it's my great pleasure to have with us Dr. Michael Torre, a professor of philosophy at the University of San Francisco and a relatively recent former president of the American Maritain Association. Dr. Torre has written on topics related to the problem of evil, and so we're bringing him on today to discuss this in several works by Maritain. So I just want to welcome you to the podcast.
Thank you, Matthew.
All right. So can you begin? General question that we always ask, because it's kind of interesting how everybody gets into the thought of Maritain. What is your, you can say, connection and entree into the thought of Maritain?
Well, like Maritain, I am a Catholic convert, and I was a graduate student, lay student in theology, and because that's what it interested me as an undergraduate. And I had become very interested in the view of Thomas Aquinas. I found his thought compelling. So that's what I was studying. And as a recent convert, I was troubled by what appeared to be a possible conclusion that I wanted to avoid, which was that although Thomas is very strong on God being the first cause of everything, the Lord and creator and governor of the universe, all good comes from him. The one behind the world we live in is the reason for it. It worried me that would also end up by entailing that he also was the origin or the founder, however indirectly, the cause of the evil in the world, including moral evil. So I was ruminating or saying stuff like that to a fellow graduate student, and he happened to be somebody who loved Maritain. And so he said, well, you should read Maritain. And so I did. And I think actually I had already read a variety of things of Maritain, because as a convert, and roughly from the same kind of intellectual background as Maritain's, I needed to get some guidance for how to connect my own previous intellectual thoughts with my newfound faith. And I found Maritain very good, very helpful. And so I was happy to go to Maritain. And I there discovered a position on the permission of sin that he articulated that I found compelling. I studied that question as a graduate student, looking at various Protestant and Catholic views on that, and chose that as the topic to concentrate on for my thesis. Maritain, in his God and the Permission of Evil, is replying to the criticism of his work by a fellow Thomist, a Dominican theologian at the University of Fribourg, called Jean-Hervé Nicolas. So I went to look at his articles in the Revue Thomiste, And there he is criticizing Maritain and also another Dominican, Francisco Muñiz, who was the disciple of a previous Spanish Dominican, Francisco Maritain. And so I then read Maritain work, and it was criticized by Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange back in the 1920s. And so I came to the conclusion that the dispute between Nicolas and Maritain, which was taking place in the early 60s, really was simply repeating a dispute that had taken place earlier in the 20s. And so I ended up by studying the first dispute in my thesis. And thereafter, I have concentrated a great deal of my scholarly work on bringing out the articles that Maritain wrote in Spanish, which I translated into English. And in general, in the Maritain Association, I've often given papers either on Thomas or on Maritain dealing with the problem of evil. That was how I got into it. I got into it as a graduate student some almost 50 years ago now. And I have continued throughout my time as a professor to deal with that issue.
I always have two quick follow-up questions. One there is more of just a follow-up observation for our listeners is to don't be tricked by Dr. Torre acting as though all he did was programmatic research on this, because he also can talk on many other things in Maritain as well, but as he's done over the years. But the other thing actually that came to my mind was, I'm trying to recall from our exchanges sometime in the past, you were a convert from pure secularism or some... And the reason I'm asking this is because, you know, the problem of evil, one can get that entree as a burning concern as an ex-Calvinist or as a very just general concern of theodicy, for lack of...
Right. So I self-described myself as a card-carrying agnostic when I was in college. Mm-hmm. My parents had baptized me as an Episcopalian, but that's all they'd known. Neither of them were practicing Christians. Neither of them were readers of the Bible. Neither of them were Episcopalians, really. My father was a lapsed Catholic, and my mother was from an Episcopalian family, but unbaptized. So I was, I would have to say, without any kind of Christian upbringing. But you mentioned Calvinism, and I certainly knew enough by the time I was reading all this to know of Calvin's harsh views on these matters, and I was quite convinced that was wrong. That it could not be right that God predestined us to evil as much as to the good, and even if one could dulcify some of what Calvin says, it more or less came down to that. And in fact, my concern initially was that it would look like the Dominican position would end up being that, and I was convinced that couldn't be true, but I wasn't exactly sure how it was not true. And it was Maritain who helped me to recognize that there was a significant difference between the kind of view that Thomas was taking, or that Augustine was taking even, and the harsher, more systematic view, you might say, of a Calvinist. I had instincts, you might say, that ran more towards, let's say, the instincts of a Plantinga than to the Council of Dort. I couldn't see buying that at all. My background was not Calvinistic.
Yeah, it's interesting because converts who come from that tradition, sometimes this will be a really burning issue as they try to square the circle becoming Catholic.
Although I do think actually, the Jesuits react very strongly against Calvinism. The Dominicans react back against the Jesuits, and this is around 1600. And so they actually come rather close to, and I would say they have some cousinly inner feelings that are not too far from, let us say, what a good Presbyterian might want to hold, because I do think that both the Presbyterians and Dominicans have a very strong sense of the sovereignty of God,
Hmm.
a very strong sense of God's will being what governs and ultimately accounts for why things are the way they are, and a very important sense of God's grace and our being saved by His grace. So, I'm sympathetic to those who do come out of that tradition. I think they would find in Thomas, as many have, uh, a good bridge for them. I think Thomas, and there have been a lot of works on this. I think Thomas and some of the Reformed tradition there, can talk to each other.
Yeah, I guess this has become interesting to me over the past few years just because I've realized I've never been dogged by this question. And living in the Byzantine East, even though there are accounts that have existed historically, it doesn't mark the Byzantine mind because it comes downstream from so much of Augustinianism.
Right.
Just interesting to see sort of that, the difference where it's just not even, it's not a kind of major polemical issue. But we'll go, I want to watch. I want to watch. You could,
But I think that's true. I think if you were to compare the East and the West on Christology in the early centuries, why that's the thing that absolutely grabs the East, but noticeably it doesn't grab the West.
Mhm.
So that you can get Pope Leo's letter sort of casually saying, what obviously is the case, which creates a great deal of problem for the East to try to kind of, well, all that's what, and in some sense, leads to monophysism. So, the East was was really wrapped up with Christology. The West gets wrapped up with anthropology,
Mhm.
and it is Augustine as the background that I think does do that. It is because of his very strong anti-Pelagian views, which become normative in the Catholic West. Um, just take one step further, and you've got a big problem.
Yeah.
Well, the East is perhaps one step to the other side of Augustine, and so it doesn't have this problem.
Yeah. And
And, and, I, and
this is the reason why
I think,
go ahead.
yeah, I think Aquinas, and I do think he is unique in this, um, really wished to reflect the mind of the whole church. And so he was as interested in what Dionysius and Damascene had to say as he was in what Augustine had to say. And on this question, he makes use of their thought as a balancing tendency, I think, in his own understanding of these issues, which prevents him from ending up in the harsher views that come to the fore at the time of the Reformation.
All right, so we'll get because I want to get us to actually an overview narrative in that vein in a second. And as I warned you, I want this to be I'd end this with this being a conversation because the extrovert in me wouldn't follow his script. So I'm going to ask something for the listeners who are here, and we have to imagine the person who is going to end up checking out 35 minutes into the podcast, and they should know at least something about the works of Maritain on this topic. So we'll drop into the argument in some more details in a little bit here, but maybe just lay out very clearly for someone who's approaching his works just the overall topology.
Yeah, be, because of Raisa, his wife's interest in the contemplative life, she sought out a spiritual director, and he was a Dominican, Humbert Clarissac. And Jacques Maritain wrote an introduction to a book that he wrote on the mystery of the church. And after he died in World War One, they found comfort and direction in another Dominican, Thomas de Hau. And then when they were interested in founding the Cercle Thomis in 1921, and again through Raisa, they got Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, another Dominican, to be the mentor of the Cercle Thomis. So Maritain, from his earliest training, or if you like training, I mean, his exposure, let us say, to the Thomistic tradition, found himself and self-described himself as a member of the Bonne École, a member of a school of interpretation of Aquinas that basically was Dominican. And so he was aware um, by the early 1920s of the views of Garrigou-Lagrange on the problem of evil and the permission of sin, because Garrigou-Lagrange got into a controversy with a man named Admet Dals, who was a Jesuit and who was the then dean of the Institut Catholique in Paris, where Maritain himself was teaching. And Garrigou-Lagrange and Allais basically repeated much of the controversy that had gone on between Jesuits and Dominicans starting from 1600. So Maritain was aware of Garrigou-Lagrange's views, and he found them to be to sort of won the day when it came to trying to understand the primacy of God's grace in relation to evil. Excuse me.
Yeah.
But he not. He felt he had not crossed the T's and dotted his I's in relation to our responsibility for sin. And we see this because he wrote letters at that time to a theological colleague of his, Charles Journet, who was then an abbé in Fribourg. And in these letters, he mentions, his view about Garrigou on this question. So from the very beginning, Maritain finds himself drawn to the Dominican position, appreciative of what Garrigou-Lagrange had to say, but not completely happy with it in terms of its ability to properly defend our own responsibility for the evil that we do.
So at this point, as you continue, I just maybe want to ask a question right there. Do you see him as, in a sense, thinking he's correcting Garrigou's position? Because he basically says that at one point. He kind of praises the forward motion of the tradition of Garrigou, even though he makes some pretty significant changes then on the issue of the line of evil and the permission of sin.
Well, I think that it was Maritain's hope, and I think it was Maritain's own self-judgment, that he was staying within and fundamentally defending a line of thinking that the Dominicans had defended from the time of these controversies in the early 17th century. So I think he felt that he was certainly in the same line. But like I said, I don't think he felt that Garrigou's explanation of the sufficiency of grace and of our own responsibility for evil quite got the job done. And so obviously he was trying to get the job done. So yes, I think he was trying to articulate better what he took to be something that we should be saying. And I think he believed that his own interpretation was simply getting at what Thomas himself was all about, and that Garrigou hadn't quite done that.
So continue.
And we know from a letter that Garrigou wrote him that Garrigou was not happy with him. He could see that he was departing from him on a key point, and he didn't like it. Mm-hmm. Maritain wrote on this question in various small little ways in the 30s, but nothing significant. The first work of his that's significant is his Marquette lecture at the University of Marquette in 1942. Little book, St. Thomas and the Problem of Evil. Actually, I would recommend it to people who are interested in Maritain. They begin there. Mm-hmm. It's a simple lecture of about an hour. It really lays out his own views quite clearly in relation to Thomas. I recommend that as a place to begin. And then when he was the ambassador to the Vatican in 1948, he wrote a book called Existence et l'Existante. And one of the chapters of that book goes into considerable detail about how to understand the relationship between grace and free will, and especially in relation to our own refusal of grace. And that led to a number of articles in the Revue Thomiste, many of them very favorable towards Maritain, but eventually Jean-Hervé Nicolas wrote a very critical article in 1960 against both Maritain and Meunier, and that led to Maritain's final major work on the subject, God and the Permission of Evil, which he wrote in 1963. You can find various other of his works in the 50s and even up to his last work in 1973, Untrammeled Paths, that touch on this or that little aspect of this matter. But Maritain's three books that are most connected to this problem are the three I've mentioned.
Okay.
The Marquette Lecture in 42, the chapter in Existence and Existent in 48, and God and the Permission of Evil, which is his final and most definitive work in 1963. Now, if you go researching Maritain, as I have, you'll find other references, other things of some interest, but those are the three main works in which he lays out his position.
Yeah, and just to make sure we really articulate that clearly for the listeners, that little Marquette lecture is a very good place to start. If you're looking to have a textual study that's digestible and isn't quite in the fray in the same way then that the other works are. So I think that is a very good place for people.
That's right, because the one on Thomas, which in some ways is his best work, is clear. It's related to Thomas, and it's not actually taking on the Baroque controversies.
Mm-hmm.
In the next two, especially Existence and the Existent, he gets into discussing sufficient efficacious grace, the various kinds of distinctions and problems that have been raised in the earlier debates. He continues that in God and the Permission of Evil. So there he's right in the center of all of the theological controversy, if you like, and it's a little bit more difficult to sort through.
Yeah, it's all presupposed. I remember the first time I read that, you sort of, I backed into my Thomism, and you just feel a little bit like you've walked into a bar fight. It's well worth it, but it's just harder unless you have then the background to sort of see what's.
Yeah, well, there are controversies, and there are controversies, and of course there were controversies between, as I say, Jesuits and Dominicans, and there were people that didn't agree with either of them. The middle schools, whether they were following the thought of Saint Francis Liguori or Augustinians or various others. But you also get, and this is very recherche, you get debates between Dominicans, as to what our position should be. Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's really recherche. Yeah. So if you end up, looking at that first, you might well find yourself feeling slightly lost.
Yeah. Yeah, and some people have been turned off by some of they think of it as neologisms because he's trying to philosophically deal with the problem of the shatterability of motions, divine motions, right? And so he uses some language of his own there. And I've met some people.
He does. I find Maritain wants to popularize if he can. He wants to make it digestible if he can. And so he even says in a footnote, all I'm doing is supplying more graphic language for past distinctions, right? And so he has this word brisable, breakable, literally, which he uses for what was spoken of as sufficient grace. I'm not of the view that this ultimately is helpful because I do think that when you get to the kind of very formal and technical distinctions that these men are trying to make, that when you then come up with an image, it's going to limp and probably is going to create some confusion because in the first place, we're not talking about material things at all. We're talking about immaterial acts of intellect and will. And so you're going to end up by thinking of footballs and things that can break, and all of these things end up probably not entirely illuminating what you need to say. So it is true he does do that. I don't think his thought is um, especially helpful when he does that.
Or it's at least not well served by his images, maybe is the
Well, it'll lead to some obvious ripostes, which then you have to deal with, and yeah, you can end up by just getting it more complicated rather than less. So I understand and appreciate why some people feel that yeah, this is unduly complicated, and just can't. This does it turns them off. I can see why that might happen. I don't think that's Thomas. I don't think that's the best of the commentary tradition, and I don't think that's the best of Maritain either. Yeah, I would be understanding of their frustration, but I think there's more gold there than just that difficulty.
yeah. So okay, now I'm going to give you a big runway and just where you need to eventually land. So that's some mixing metaphors, I suppose. Well, I guess you're landing a plane. Um, will be in view of past controversies, and then more generally the problem of both evil, permission of sin, etc., where Maritain's position and concern stands. But I'm going to, invite you to begin by just laying out, sort of the general stakes of the problem, because as you even said, there are controversies and then there are controversies, and the problem is that the issue here with Maritain is that he's kind of in the midst of this internal controversy about a bigger controversy that by itself is already, I would even say in its own way, recherché. So why don't you just go ahead and lay out for people kind of the general.
Well, let me begin, if I may, by just saying that whenever we talk about God, we're talking about something we don't really understand. We don't know what God is. We can't define God. We don't know the way God is. And Thomas even says that when we see God face to face, we still won't comprehend God. We can't get our mind around God, and God is too great for that. So I think we should always remember when we try to think about these things, the degree to which we're limping, the degree to which we're just reaching for as best we can. We want to understand, and it's right that we should want to understand, but we should always be very cautious, I think, in what we want to say. In the second place, let me first then also say what this problem is not about. Okay. So Maritain doesn't have an answer for why Johnny got run over. And if people want to know why some particularly bad, nasty thing happens to somebody, what good justifies that, he has no answer for that. And no one has an answer for that. That's something that has to be born with love. It's not something we have an answer for. Likewise, if someone says, well, why did Johnny contract this bad disease and die at 3? And since he was baptized, go straight to heaven. Whereas his twin brother, Bill, survived the disease. He went on to be a tyrant and ended in hell. How come Johnny got to go to heaven and Bill ended up in hell? So again, Maritain does not have an answer for that kind of question either. So if people want to know the answer to those questions, I'm afraid that's not the kind of problem that I'll be talking about today. You'll note that problem does concern what we might call the final cause. What's the good that justifies not preventing this or that evil? And since we don't know the mind of God and we don't know all goods, we don't know all evils, we don't know all their interrelation, we don't know the answer to that question. Now, sometimes it's said, well, there is no possible good that could justify a God not preventing various evils. But Maritain thinks that that's not true. He thinks you can't make an argument to the effect that there's no possible good that could justify God's not preventing evils. And in fact, there are two quite obvious goods that one would refer to. In the first place, there is the good of our choosing, and choosing rightly when we don't have to. When saying yes to love rather than saying no to love. To saying yes when we could say no. To staking our all when it could have been the other way around. Now, of course, if that's going to be part of the way we love, then there is the possibility that we won't love rightly. So there's one reason why you wouldn't necessarily prevent the possibility of evil. And then when evil does happen, of course, many great goods are drawn from it. The heroism of the quiet heroism of people who love in the face of great suffering. In fact, all of our life is intermingled between evil and good, and we love in the face of death and of loss. We don't really know what some sort of paradisical world without evil would feel like. It's so much not what our world is. So, I think that if one can go on at great length about this problem, what could justify possibly not preventing evil, but that's not the problem that Maritain is concerned with. At least it's not the problem he's principally concerned with, and it's not the principal problem today in our discussion. But there is another problem, and that problem has to do with the agency of evil, not with what justifies it, but with what brings it about. And the worry is that God brings it about. And so you can get a poem by Archibald MacLeish, Job, in which he says, if God is God, he is not good. And if God is good, he is not God. Take the even, take the odd. But what you're not going to ever get is a God that is both all powerful and all good. So the problem here is then how to reconcile the power of God, the sovereignty of God, with the goodness of God, with the benevolence of God, with the innocence of God. How can we speak about God being the cause of all that is good, but we're the cause of what is sinful and what is not good? And that's a problem. And that problem is set by Augustine. Augustine had two controversies in his life. The first was with the Manichees, and in that controversy, he was very clear. No, we're the ones that cause evil. Right? It's not matter. It's not some evil God. No, it's us. It's our will that is responsible for our sin. And then he got another controversy with Pelagius and his followers at the end of his life. And in that controversy, he says, but God's grace is what makes us saved. God's grace is what is responsible for all the saving good that we do. So in the second controversy, then, when it comes to the good, that's all on the side of God. So Augustine sets the problem, which is, well, how do you reconcile those two fundamental positions? And this comes to the fore in the Reformation because the reformers are pessimists when it comes to these questions, and they lean towards the view that basically everything is grace. And the Council of Trent said, well, that's going too far. No, you have to affirm our freedom as well. And so Catholic theologians then tried to come up with positions that showed the concord of God's will and our will, God's providence and our choices, such that God is indeed the cause of all that is good, but we are the cause of what is not. And there were two major moments in these controversies. The first one was at 1600. Dominicans and Jesuits got into a big quarrel on this question called the De Auxiliis controversy about the aids of God's grace. Broadly speaking, the Dominicans were all for grace and the Jesuits were all for freedom. That's very simple, but that's the kind of the gist of it. But then 50 years later, there was a second moment when the church condemned Jansenism, because there the church said, well, we can resist God's grace. We can resist God's interior grace. So the Dominican positions had to be firm about the importance of God's grace, the first one, but also had to take in consideration, yes, but we can resist God's grace, the second one. And so the question for the Dominican tradition was, well, how do you put those two things together? And there are various ways that you could, and Garrigou-Lagrange certainly articulated one typical way. And that's the background to Maritain's own view, because he did not feel that he had done justice to the sufficiency of God's grace or to our responsibility for sin. And so he tried to articulate exactly how that was the case. And that's his fundamental doctrine on this matter. Now I can go on and talk
Yeah,
about
so
that.
maybe what would be useful then is to lay out sort of the status quo ante, like what you find in those works from the 20s by Garrigou, and then make clear then Maritain's response and what he's adding in the line of evil. So I think giving a nice summary for people would be very useful.
Yes, well, yes. Okay, so there's so many points that one can bring up here. Let me try a slightly very close to what you're asking, but slightly different. Let me explain how Maritain thought we should understand our responsibility for sin.
Mm-hmm.
It's not quite what Garrigou himself had said, although he says things somewhat similar to it. Okay, but here's what Maritain took as his view. He thinks that by nature and especially by God's preparatory grace, by his interior actual grace that touches us, that we are inclined towards what is truly good. God directs us, as he directs all of his creatures, towards what is truly good. So we then find ourselves empowered to consider a particular good that's in front of us. And we can, because we are the intellectual beings that we are, we can consider this good from a variety of different points of view. Let's suppose that we're allergic to chocolate, but we have tasted it in the past and it's yummy. And now here we are. We have some chocolate in front of us, which is not good for us, although it is yummy. Well, we can consider that it's yummy. Okay. So while we're considering the delectable good, if you like, or while we're considering that aspect of the good in front of us that's pleasurable, we're not considering something else. That's what we're considering. Okay. So we're not considering that actually we're allergic to chocolate. We're just considering that it's yummy. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. We go on in our deliberation to say, yes, it is yummy, but last time I had chocolate, I broke out in hives, and no, this is not good for me, and I ought not to endanger my health this way with chocolate. So thank you, but no, I'm not going to have any chocolate. Okay. So the fact that we initially were considering that it was yummy is perfectly okay. It's not considering that it's bad for us. It's considering that it's yummy. That's okay. That's not a privation. That's not a sin of any kind. We go on often and to say yes, but we resist that. We're not going to do that. Okay, but when we choose chocolate, when we bite into it and go yum yum, right? Is precisely because we're not considering that this is no good for us. What we are considering when we decide to do it is what makes it yummy. And then that not considering what we should have considered renders our choice wrong. we make a bad choice, right? So whenever we make the wrong choice, whenever we sin, whenever we turn in the wrong direction, there is something, and that prior thing is that we're not considering what we need to consider. Because if we are considering what we need to consider, we won't choose it. I mean, if we're considering it's no good, then we won't choose it. Okay. Now note, in deliberation, we can go back and forth. Take something like The Bicycle Thief by Torre. Very painful and beautiful movie. It features a man who needs a bicycle in order to feed his family, and somebody steals it, and he's desperate. He knows somebody else's bicycle back. We see that he knows that, but he's desperate, and so he tries to steal the bicycle. So earlier in his deliberations, he knew he shouldn't do that because he was considering that stealing is wrong, right? But when he is led to do it, when he chooses to steal a bicycle, it's because he is thinking, I need it, I have to have it, it's the only way I can help my family, right? That's what he's considering. He's not considering that that's theft, and theft is unjust, and he shouldn't act unjustly. He's considering something else. So whenever we make the wrong choice, right, there's always something antecedent to it. And what's antecedent to it in our deliberation is a consideration of something that's not the rule, something that we're going to act on, but that we shouldn't act on. Okay. So Maritain's point is that this absence of consideration is simply on us, right? The bicycle thief could have kept on thinking, no, it's theft, I can't do it. The person who's got chocolate in front of him could have said, yeah, but this is to make me sick. In other words, at the time of deliberation, you can say this is good or this is not good. You can consider this or you can not consider this. So our not considering what we need to consider in deliberation is simply on us. Okay. And it's not from God. On the contrary, God has empowered us to choose rightly. God has inclined us to, through our nature and through our grace to recognize what we should do. So we could have considered what we should have considered, but we don't. We don't do what we could have done. Okay, and so that's why sin is our fault. That's why we say mea culpa, mea culpa, mea max. But it's because there is something we don't do. We don't use our head. We don't use our God-given empowerment the way God had done. And as a consequence of that, we sin. And so sin is our fault. We're the first cause of it. God doesn't want us to do this. He's directing us to do the right thing, but he's respecting who we are, and who we are is a being that can follow that direction or can fail to follow that direction. And of course, if we do follow it, it's because we're being empowered to, or being inclined to. So if we do the right thing, God has moved us to do the right thing, and we're cooperating with it. But we can fail to cooperate, and it's that failure that renders sin our fault.
So then, can you
and so
explain?
that's the way then he understands his problem. So technically, then, if you wish to give the technical words, the grace that we've been given, the sufficient grace that we've been given, means that in fact we could choose the right thing. It also means that we might not, and unfortunately, we don't. And that we don't is simply on us. It's a first cause. There's no explanation for it other than we just screw up. It's like, well, I screwed up. Yeah, like I failed. My fault. Yeah, I did something I shouldn't have done, and I knew I shouldn't, or I should have paid attention to it, and I didn't. And that's on me. And it didn't have to be. God's grace is inclining us towards what is good. So if we don't fail God, we will do the right thing. Perhaps for readers or listeners, rather, the parable of the talents is not an irrelevant parable. right? God gives talents 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 to each of these people, and then he goes off, or the master goes off, and the servants then take the 5 talents and they turn it into 5 more, 4 more, 3 more, 2 more. But the one who has 1 doesn't. He could have, but he doesn't. He buries it, right? In other words, um, he doesn't make use of what he could have made use of. He's been given, he's been empowered. It's only 1 talent, but he's been empowered to make use of the 1 talent by God. But he doesn't. He buries it. God's not very nice to him about that. The master comes back and said, "You bad servant, I'm taking away that 1 talent I gave you and giving it to the one who had 5." It's a rather hard parable. But clearly the idea here is, well, he could have used it, right? When we fail, we didn't have to fail. We could have made use of what God gave us. So there are many unrealized possibilities in the world, because we don't do what we could have done. And so I think with this, then Maritain believes that he has succeeded in underlining our responsibility for sin. But at the same time, he thinks he has articulated the way that occurs in such a way as not to lessen the importance of God's grace. We can't act well except that God has inclined us, that God has moved us to do what is right. And when we do what is right, we're only acting under and by what he has given us. And indeed, he has other places in his work where he insists on the radical efficacy of God's grace. And so he thinks that his own position is completely compatible with kind of line that earlier Dominicans had taken, but that it manages to avoid what he took to be its central problem, which was that it so emphasized grace as not to be able to explain how it is that we sin. Because some Dominicans and some Thomists, and you can still find them today, are of the view that every motion of God, every grace of God, always affects and infallibly affects whatever it's given for. And if that's the case, then it's very hard to see how we resist it. And in fact, it's very hard to see what sense there is when you say that you resist it. And so he thinks that's an exaggerated view and wrong. And that's where he draws back from, let us say, a position that seemed to be that of Garrigan. He insists with the church against the Jansenists that we can indeed resist and impede the interior graces that God gives us. So those graces are given for a purpose, which is to create and do something good, but they're given in accordance with our own fallible nature. And so they're given in a way that it's up to us to follow, and we can fail to follow. And when we fail to follow, that's on us. When we follow is by virtue of being empowered and directed and moved to do that. We're just cooperating with it as a second cause. That's the way he wants to try to articulate those particular truths. That's what he took as the correction that was needed to Garrigan.
And I think it's important for listeners to see that the real emphasis here is that non-consideration of the rule and that quote unquote causality that's occurring is wholly in the line of a kind of non-being. And hence,
right. So the only thing that as first causes that we do is to fail. Mm-hmm. When we freely choose what is good, that's not as a first cause. That's by virtue of following as a second cause all of the empowerment that we've been given by God, who remains the first cause of all that is good. So when you have, as he thinks we do have, God as the first cause and ourselves as the instrument of that or the servant of that, then it is certainly true that the servant has done something, but he's only done it underneath the master's rule and guidance. And so he is the master, the first cause, the servant's the second cause of all that is good. But when it comes to evil, no, we're the first cause of it. because we turn away and fail to do something that we could have done. And that failure is simply on us. Uh, we we want that other thing. And people who say, "Oh, come on, this is really absurd. Why would we do that? Cutting off our nose to spite our face. Why don't we do the right good thing?" But unfortunately, we don't. That's what sin is. That's the mystery of iniquity. That we're willing to to rule in hell rather than serve in heaven, as Milton has the devil say. That we want to be ruled by our own order.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to follow somebody else's order.
Yeah, and so there's kind of absurdity that's
that you'd say, well, but you're not going to be happy, and the answer that's going to come back is the happiness I have is the happiness I want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and C.S. Lewis, tries to, and I think somewhat successfully, dramatize this by having a bus leave hell with some people in it, and they go up to heaven. They don't like it. They want to go back to hell, right? So the door to hell is locked from the inside. The people who choose to be their own order and not to follow God's order, right? They regard that as true happiness. And if you say, well, that seems pretty crazy to me, say, well, look around you. I'm sure there are a lot of people that would affirm that. And come to think of it, how about looking at yourself? Aren't there times when you, in fact, have given into that? Presumably, that's true. That's what sin is, and presumably we do give in to this, wanting it our way, and thereby not considering that this goes against something deeper and better. And of course, many people are in very painful situations. It's very hard to resist the things they fall into. It's not up to us to judge people. Only God can see the heart of people. Only God knows the degree to which people are, truly turning towards the light or are hardening themselves against it. But it does seem as though, when you look at the world, that all is not just rosy and good. And Stalin shakes his fist at God on his deathbed, right? I mean, there are people who just do seem to have made up their mind that they don't want that, right? They're not willing. They don't use what they could because they want something else.
All right.
Anyway.
So, no, it's good. No, it's all good.
That's kind of getting heavy there, if you'd like. But in terms of the,
I want to get us to the debate, because I want you to be able to then connect this at least to something you said earlier, and it could even be a forward pointer then for the listeners, because you noted the fact that, so someone like myself, I tend to do everything I can. I mean, I'm not super invested in the debate, so I don't do it all that often. But I tend to read Garrigou as much as I can in this direction, even though I know it's a fool's bargain. You can't go the whole way. But there are these elements in him that are things he says that you could see how a Maritain would want to use those as hooks to try to fix issues in the line of evil. But ultimately, when you put those two thinkers next to each other, you sort of have a parallel that Jean-Hervé Nicolas sees later. That just as amid the controversies more in like what the late 20s, early 30s between Garrigou and Marinsola, you now have between Nicolas and Garrigou. And that's what occasions the final work. And so maybe it would just be useful to give a very quick overview of, I know that you're thinking it, you wrote an entire book on this and a very long dissertation on it. But, how is it, what is this, nuance of a nuance of a nuance that's at the heart of this, the debate intra-Dominicanly that has the of this bit with Garrigou and Marinsola, and then what happens in the 60s when Jean-Hervé Nicolas, who was in some ways a friend of Maritain, however, critiques him on it.
Indeed. In fact, all these people, they're all sort of Dominicans, so they're all kind of friends. And I mean, Maritain's not Dominican, but he certainly has a mind that's often formed by Dominicans. Yes, I think I can do this. Let me say as background, there are two ways in which Dominicans might try to deal with the fact that they've got this kind of classic school position against the Jesuits, articulated by Banez and his followers, Alvarez and Lemos in 1600s. And then they've got this anti-Jansenist position articulated in France by people like Nicolas, and then that's not John Hervé Nicolas, it's a different Nicolas. Gonnet and Bill Wart, and then there's others, Goudin, Assoulay. These are all people who are Dominicans that come after the Jesuits. So one of the ways in which you could say, well, how do we put these things together, is to come down very, very strong because you're here for your school, the jargon, right? So you come very strong on Banez, right? And then you simply say, well, this other thing that happens at the Jansenist time, yes, that's something we need to bring in, but we can do that. We hold on to the same basic position as earlier, but we just slightly dulcify it, okay? The second way of dealing with those two things is to say, well, there's a real development here. The people in the post-Jansenist era go back to and retrieve some ideas in Floriensis and Capriolus, and you can find in the Salmanticenses, and actually develop the Thomistic line. They hold on to the essentials, but they let go of certain things that are too harsh in Banez and Alvarez. And when we do that, we hold on to the essential, but we develop it in the right direction. Okay, and that's the way in which someone like Maritain Sola believed the Dominican tradition should be understood. So they're putting these things together differently. Okay, now the key place where this comes to the fore is in a distinction that begins in Chrysostom, and you spoke of being from the East. So this is something the East is like, right? It starts with Chrysostom and it gets into Damascene, right? And this concerns the distinction between the antecedent and consequent will of God, right? Or the conditioned and the absolute will of God. Because Chrysostom and Damascene said, well, God's true will is to save us. That's what he wants. God's good. and God wants to save us, right? Okay, so his will not to save us, that's only due to the fact that we turn away from him, right? So there is this very strong sense that there's an antecedent possibility of salvation that God gives us because he wants to save us. And at the time of the first controversy, a number of Dominicans, Banez amongst them, and then Alvarez, and to a certain extent Lemos after him, and they're following some ideas that Cadreddin had, took the view that, well, this antecedent will really is nothing more than a wish. You know, I mean, it's like, well, I wish I could fly, but I can't. So what does that lead to? It leads to no action. You know, I want to be immortal. Well, that's very nice, but you're not going, you're going to die. So if you just have a velleity, a wish for something, no action follows from it. It's a ground of nothing. Okay. So if you think of God's will to save, his antecedent will, the will that Chrysostom and Damascene talked about, as just a velleity, as a wish, not idle wish, well, then nothing comes of it, right? And then the only will that really counts is an absolute will, and whatever God absolutely wills happens, right? And so if that's your view, it becomes extremely hard to understand how you can resist God's will, because the antecedent will is the ground of nothing to be resisted, and the absolute will can't be resisted. So how in the world then can you do justice to the claim of the church that we do resist God's grace? Because God's grace is given to us because he wants us to have it. So if we resist the grace, we're resisting what he wants. So in some sense, we're resisting God's will. But, you know, that doesn't square very well with the earlier position that Banyas had staked out, because he followed Cajetan on the view that, well, there really is only one willing God. And God, whatever God wills happens, and that's all there is to it. So in other words, he gives up on the antecedent will, and you can find Dominicans or you find Thomas who will say, well, Thomas held that in his earlier views, but then in his later years, he changed his mind. And so some of the language in the sentences and De Veritate, which are early works, those don't count. What counts is what he says later, and what he says later, basically, let's go of this, and he thinks of it just as a wish. So Garrigou, Garrigou's a little unhappy with that. And the thing that Maritain notices about Garrigou is that Garrigou wants to try to make the antecedent will have some kind of place in this account. Okay. I think Maritain's argument against Garrigou is, although he wants to, he doesn't succeed in doing it. He'd like to have some weight in his understanding of these matters, but it actually ends up not, because he ends up always coming back to the Banyasian line, which really doesn't have room for that. Whereas the position that, let us say, Maransola articulates, and the one that Maritain himself articulates, in effect says, look, God, Thomas does not give up that idea. You've misunderstood him when you reduce the antecedent will to a veleity. Whenever Thomas says it's like a veleity, he's always comparing it to something. So he says that the person, this is from Aristotle, the person who's guiding the ship, would wish that he didn't have to throw the goods overboard. But he does throw the goods overboard because it's the only way of saving the ship, right? Why is that? Because there's a storm. And the other example is Prince. The prince would like to not have to punish this person and execute him. He would wish he didn't have to, but he does, right? Why? Well, because he's a criminal, and because he's done something terribly against the good of the Republic. And looking at the good of the Republic, the prince concludes that, he has to do this. So when Thomas is talking about God's salvific will as only a veleity, he's supposing a hardened sinner, right? God, would wish to save this hardened sinner, but the hardened sinner doesn't want to be saved. Okay, and so God doesn't want him to be saved either, if that's what the hardened sinner wants. Mm-hmm. So if there is a way in which it's a veleity, but it's a veleity on the supposition that you've already sinned. It's not a veleity by itself. So if I say to you, let's take a batter hits the ball with enough energy and height and so on, it'll be a home run, okay, unless some outfielder jumps up above the fence and snags it, right? So when the hitter hits the ball, he certainly wants to hit a home run. Right? In fact, he's hit it with enough to be a home run, right? It only isn't a home run because somebody jumps up and stops it, right? And again, with God gives us graces sufficient to lead us to him at that time, to help us to be in the right place at that time. He wants us to be in the right place, but yes, we can stop it. And if we do, well, yeah, then that didn't have any effect. That's true, but it doesn't have any effect because of us, not because of God's will. So the place where this gets discussed between these people is, what's the right way to understand the antecedent will of God? Right? Mm-hmm. Is there a way in which God giving, let us say, somebody graces and putting them in a state of grace has given them conditions and has given them inclinations and has given them the means by which they could be saved? Is that true? And I think that Maritain thinks, that Thomas thinks, and that we all should think, that the answer is yes. Yeah. And so our not being saved is because we don't want it, because we resist it, because we turn away from it, because we don't accept, we don't act with, we don't cooperate with what we've been given. And so there is a way in which God wants something, right? It's a conditioned wanting. I want this to be so, provided that you want it too, right? You know, and that provision doesn't make it absolute. That provision makes it conditioned, but that doesn't make it a validity. That doesn't make it some kind of inefficacious wanting. No, it's a particularly good kind of wanting. It's a wanting that is proportioned to who we are as human beings. And the obvious analog to it is the way in which parents treat their children. You know, the father gives the child the keys to drive the car. He's tried to instruct that person as best he can on how to drive a car. He wants that person to drive that car safely. He gives them the keys and again insists to drive safely. But when he puts those keys into the hands of that child, he knows that he's still a child, really, 18, whatever. And possibly he won't, drive well. That's possible. He'll possibly get into an accident. Does the father want that? Of course not. But then why does he do it? Well, because that's the way a human being is, right? That this is somebody who has reached the time when, he has to take responsibility where he has to, drive a car, and that has risks to it, right? That
No,
I love to
no,
tell a story.
no, go ahead, please do.
May he rest in peace. He was a wonderful man. Told a story on himself. He had a cat, and my friend's name was Irving. And Irving's cat would go to the screen door of his apartment and meow, and Irving would open the screen door, and the cat wouldn't go out, which annoyed her. And so he explained to his neighbor why he was annoyed with his cat, and the neighbor said, Irving, what's the problem? The cat doesn't want to go. The cat just wants to be able to. That's us.
Yeah,
we don't want to leave our Father's house.
Mm-hmm.
Be able to. We want to stay because we chose to stay.
Mm-hmm.
God treats us in accordance with ourselves. God treats us with the way we are, and so it comes with a risk, right? So if you want that antecedent will, then is that conditioned will has to do with who we are, and it has to do with the way God treats us, right? He wants what's right for us, but he wants it only he wants it finally be set because we want it too, and he lets us not want it. Now that's part of who we are. We might decide we don't want it, and that's not a validity. That's not wanting to save us. It's a conditioned will to save us, but it has its effect. And its effect is inclining us to what is good, making the good possible for us, really and truly here and now possible. And even though it's not a final and definitive will, it is a will, it is a grace, it is a good that does have its effect. That is the position that Thomas takes, according to Maritain. I think he's right. That's the position that Maritain tries to defend.
Yeah, instead of taking us, there's a couple technical things I was thinking. It's like, well, what if we have a listener who's thinking X? But I'm going to leave it there because it's not our goal in these to fix the speculative issue for them, right?
I'm happy to, I love talking.
I've got other musings too.
I could talk about it for hours.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time thinking about it. So anyway, yeah.
Because the other thing I would like to just point out, because I think speculatively more interesting, to be honest, is precisely this issue with wish that you bring up. I think that very often the accounts of wish and velleity, and hence also simple willing, are often very impoverished in kind of traditional scholastic and Thomistic accounts. They sort of are velleity is just sort of placed into this domain of pure wish, sort of the shrugging of the shoulders, wish it could have been, but it can't be, right? So it doesn't
Right.
really matter. And yet, if you think about in our moral agency, just in our moral agency, if we don't have a spontaneous reaction appetitively to the good, even if we can't do it right now. Whenever you watch a movie or you read a moral novel or something, and you see, or you're reading, you encounter an exemplar of virtue, and you react in such a way, you say, "That's the kind of act that I would do." It's just literally not the sort of thing I can do right now because the circumstances are not here, right? That wish, yes, it's inefficacious, but it's so important for the development of moral character, and I feel it's lost precisely because of this impoverishment of wish.
But that could well be. There's a big difference between simple will and a velleity.
Yes.
The simple will is our attraction to what is good.
Mm.
And if we didn't have a simple will of the good, we wouldn't will anything.
Correct. I think
In fact, the simple will of the good is what gets it all going. It's because we want something that we then deliberate about it.
Mm-hmm.
It may turn out in our deliberation that we decide we can't do it now, but we haven't reached that initially. Initially, we set about deliberating about it, and possibly we can, and then we go on and try to do something, right? See, so simple will is different than velleity,
Correct.
and a conditioned will is also different from velleity. A velleity is what is left of the conditioned will when the condition is placed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so before the criminal has done anything wrong, the prince certainly does not want to punish so and so, right? He only is willing to punish him if, right, the person has done something deserving of punishment. Well, then if he has done something deserving of punishment, then yeah, then he wishes he could do otherwise, but he can't. But prior to that condition, no, there is no inefficacy, right? See, so you had to be very careful about a lot of these things, and I think you're probably right that thought deserves to be given to all of these things very carefully. And these are hard problems. No matter which position you take, then there's something else you have to try to deal with. And, people often take the positions they do because they think that taking the opposite's worse. So they'll say, well, yes, I've got that problem, but you've got this problem. And then they'll come back at you with whatever that is. Right. So it's very hard to get all these things straight. So I understand why there are controversies. It's a very hard thing to understand.
Yeah. Well, Michael, let's draw to a close by, leaving you with the sort of last word you want to leave our listeners with.
Well, I guess two quick thoughts. One, I would not give up on this. In other words, a lot of this can seem very, as you say, recherche, distinctions without a difference, things that can't be held on to. I would not give into that. It seems to me that it's our very nature to want to know, and there's nothing we want to know more about than where we came from and where we're going. And we have a natural desire to know God and to see God. So it's natural for us to want to understand this as best we can. And so I certainly think it's worth working at. The second thing I would say is I think that for Maritain, what he would want to defend and what he would want the listeners here to hold on to is the innocence of
Mm-hmm.
the goodness of God. We need to say yes to life. It's a life that is under the governance of God. God is wise and good. We need to say yes to it, while also saying absolutely no to all of the sins and things in our lives that are not good. And that is to follow God, because that's exactly what God also is about. A radical innocence of this kind of sin, completely foreign to who God is, completely not God, who is pure goodness. Um, but he governs the world with his wisdom, and he permits these things to occur. We have to say yes to the life he's given us, but also recognize his absolute innocence. And I think that's the thought that Maritain would want us to hold on to.
I think that's a good place to end, the appropriate place to, given what he wanted, is the goal of his kind of driving this whole issue for him. So,
Yeah.
all right. Well, thank you, Dr. Torre, for coming today to be part of this. Maritain Musings is a project, once again, of the American Maritain Association. We'd also like to thank Mr. Michael Hall for his post-production work on this. And if you're interested in the work of the American Maritain Association, please visit us at the American Maritain Association.com.